So our next presenter is going to give us some insight into some directions we can pursue our political power for the future, representing citizen action, common cause. Just too many names very similar. Common Cause has been fighting a lot of important issues for a long time, and Jay Heck, Executive Director, is with us. We're very happy to have him with us today, and he spent a lot of time thinking and working on the issue of a nonpartisan redistricting, which we can see what the last round of redistricting did to Wisconsin. So he's going to share his insights about that and a number of other things. So thank you, Jay, for being with us.
Well, thanks very much, Nate, for having me follow the previous performance. It's always a little tough to follow something like that, but I'll do my best. Thanks. It's great to come to a gathering like this. You know who the real hardcore are. The snow didn't keep you away. I of course, yesterday put my snow shovels in the garage, and of course, this is what happens. It's always the case. On the way out, I saw a number of signs on the way out to Mazomanie from Madison, and I saw my first John Kasich sign. And I am a native of Ohio, or Ohio, as we say back in Ohio. And only now would John Kasich be considered a moderate and a reasonable guy. Back in Ohio, we call him a right-wing lunatic. He's arguably the most anti-choice governor in the country with regard to women. And that might even include Scott Walker, although I think now that Walker's got wind of that, he's doing his best to catch up. Listen, the reason I wanted to come here, and I'm so grateful that Nate invited me, was really my talk should be subtitled The Retroactive Decriminalization of Political Corruption in Wisconsin. Because that's really what has happened over the last 5 years, and really in the last 6 months, to a degree that no other state has experienced. And it's, I think, an issue that we as activists, we as progressives, can utilize effectively during this election year. Because there are people in this state that may have very different views about public policy issues than we do. But, there is a shared sense of fairness to some degree amongst a lot of the population here. And there's some real resentment about what the majority power party in the Wisconsin legislature and the governor have done to stack the deck in their favor. And I think that if you are knowledgeable and can talk to these issues a bit, you'll have some success in motivating people to turn out and vote in a way that's going to be much more difficult, as you know, than it has been really ever in Wisconsin. And let me explain what I'm talking about. I moved here from Washington, D.C. in 1988, 28 years ago, to work in the Capitol. At that time, Wisconsin had a national reputation as being the most honest, most transparent, cleanest, good government state in the nation that every other state wanted to emulate. It was the model for everybody. You know that. Many of you were active back then and doing what you needed to do to keep Wisconsin that way. And over the last 28 years, coincidentally the time that I've spent here, it seems to have gotten a little worse. despite my best efforts. But there's a reason for that, and it was something that happened nationally. You know, we had a guy named Newt Gingrich gain power in the early 90s. And in Wisconsin, he had a guy by the name of Scott Jensen who viewed Newt Gingrich as his political mentor. And Jensen, I think, more than anybody, was responsible for ushering in a different kind of politics in Wisconsin. And you know what happened. We went from a state that in 1986, when Tommy Thompson defeated Tony Earl, an election that cost a total of $3 million by both sides, including outside spending. $3 million to elect the governor. To 2014, when, Matt can correct me, but I think the final figure was what, $100 million to re-elect Scott Walker. Most of that we don't even know where the money came from. So something happened in that period of time. And obviously in the last 6 years, it's accelerated to a degree that's unparalleled in the rest of the country. You know, one of the first things that Scott Walker did when he became governor in 2010 and took office in 2011 was, yes, Act 10, but in the budget that followed, he decided to end 30 years of public financing for elections in the state of Wisconsin. We'd had a system in place since really the late 70s. It was partial public financing. It was always kind of weak. It always needed to be boosted. But nevertheless, it did impose some spending limits, some sanity as to how much money people would spend, particularly in Supreme Court elections. But Walker, who never, ever bought into limits on spending or disclosure from the very beginning of his legislative career in 1994, and I know that because I worked with him when he was chairman of the Elections Committee for a number of years. He never bought into that. So one of the first things he wanted to do was get rid of public financing, and that included the 100% public financing that we had just accomplished 2 years before, in 2009, something called the Impartial Justice Bill, which was bipartisan. It had Republican support as well as Democratic support. It put spending limits on what candidates for the Supreme Court could spend. And it gave them full public financing so that they wouldn't be compromised by taking money from trial lawyers or corporations or other entities that came before the bench. That was gone by June of 2011. Followed very shortly by, as you know, the enactment of at that time, the most harsh, restrictive, extreme voter photo ID law in the country. No other state, not Alabama, not Mississippi, not South Carolina, states that had a tradition of suppressing large segments of their population, had ever imposed restrictions on voting as was done in Wisconsin in 2011. Of course, as you know, the courts held off the implementation of it until this year, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that means this year. But nevertheless, and by the way, North Carolina has since passed us in restrictions, which again, something else I'm sure the governor's looking at with great interest and will want to revisit. And by the way, has already revisited it this year to some degree by eliminating special deputy registrars, which will make it impossible for voter registration drives by citizen organizations like us to be able to register voters. So that was just part of the agenda. Then it accelerated, as you know, to a great degree this past fall in what the chairman of Common Cause, who's been chair for the last 25 years, the only reasonable Republican, I think, maybe left in Wisconsin, Bill Krause, who was a top advisor to Lee Sherman Dreyfus, Governor Knowles. He calls it the Me First agenda. And that's all the Wisconsin legislature did last fall, was instead of taking up things like the lack of job creation in the state, public education, the environment, even the transportation problems we have in the state. They concentrated all their efforts on making sure, A, they could get reelected without opposition or as little as possible, but B, also decriminalizing all the activities that they had been engaged in, really dating back to Scott Jensen and the legislative caucus scandal in 2001-2002, which, as you may recall, brought down the top 5 legislative leaders of both political parties for felony misconduct in the Capitol. And what they were very intent on doing was destroying the tools that enabled that corruption to be successfully prosecuted back then and to be able to prosecute any further corruption. And those were things like the John Doe law, which, as you may know, is a unique law for Wisconsin. Rather than having to convene a grand jury to investigate wrongdoing, what you can do in Wisconsin, and have been able to do since statehood, is have a judge work with a district attorney to call people before the court, and in exchange for providing immunity from prosecution, have them detail the people that were involved in the crimes. That's the only way we were able to discover corruption in the Capitol, by the way, in 2002. E. Michael McCann, the legendary district attorney of Milwaukee County who prosecuted Chuck Qualla, said that it would have been impossible for Qualla or Jensen or anybody else to have been brought to justice had it not been to be able to use the John Doe law. So in October of 2015, the Republican legislature met in special session not to address any issues that matter to anybody, but instead, A, to eviscerate the John Doe law so that it applies only to us, the citizens. So if you get caught in Matt's basement smoking pot, or if you get very crowded down there, by the way, or if you are engaged in any other kind of wrongdoing, the John Doe law, which is a very effective means to investigate people, will still be used for you. But what they carved out were the crimes that politicians commit from being able to use the John Doe law for investigation. Things like felony misconduct in public office, things like bribery, things like using personnel to work on your campaign in your office, maybe even your Milwaukee County Executive's office. Those types of things. This is what I mean by the retroactive decriminalization. So first they took off the tool to do the investigation. Then they destroyed the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Board, which particularly hurt because I played a big role in working with no less than Senator Michael Ellis of Neenah. Again, one of those rhinos who's gone. Ellis was a mean SOB in many ways, but one thing he cared about was at least a certain amount of honesty in state government. And so he was the godfather of the GAB, which was nonpartisan. Judges, rather than partisan politicians, would initiate investigations into corruption into the Capitol so that we wouldn't have that again. That was the idea. It worked wonderfully. It also, at our insistence, the GAB had the power to get a separate stream of funding, not controlled by the legislative leaders, to be able to initiate and investigate corruption in the Capitol. The second thing that the Republican-controlled legislature did this past fall was destroy the Government Accountability Board. By the way, Sheila Pleckton, who's with you today, was instrumental in informing the people of Wisconsin that the people of Wisconsin didn't want any of this stuff. They weren't for the John Doe law, they weren't for destroying the GAB, and they weren't for rewriting our campaign finance laws so that it would be possible for Wisconsin Club for Growth, Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, to be able to coordinate their activities with Scott Walker or Republican candidates for the legislature, which had been against the law for years and was against the law when Scott Walker engaged in it during the 2012 campaign. Again, the retroactive decriminalization of this type of behavior. So that's what they did. And of course, as you know, they rewrote the campaign finance law. Our law is somewhere between Alabama and Texas in terms of its transparency and its effectiveness in reining in outside money. This is truly the Wild West of the North. What we have here in Wisconsin, anything goes, and anything, and as you know, is going right now. The Center for Media and Democracy just put out a wonderful report just over the weekend on where the money's coming from in this state Supreme Court election. And believe me, as Donald Trump would say, believe me, it's huge. It's huge. There's massive amounts of money coming in, primarily on the side of Rebecca Bradley. So what do we do about it? Well, here's what you need to do. Voter photo ID is unquestionably a challenge for all of us, but it is not an excuse not to do it. And I think what we need to do, and what you need to do as the vanguard of progressive activism in this state, is take it upon yourselves in the couple days we have before Tuesday to at least get 5 people that you think might vote and make sure they have what they need. And that's complicated. You need to educate yourself about what you need to bring to the polling place to vote and what you need to register at the polling place if you're going to do same-day registration, which they haven't taken away from us yet, but believe me, that is on the horizon. It's incredibly important, and because we hate that it was done and because we're disgusted with them, that's not an excuse to simply complain and not take action. I want to end by saying 2 things. Why I think there is reason to be hopeful in 2016 for our side. And that is, number 1, I happened to watch last night a little bit of the gathering at Serb Hall in Milwaukee, which was the gathering of the Republican candidates, including Ted Cruz and Scott Walker announcing his endorsement of Ted Cruz publicly. But they were introduced by a talk show host from Madison who has a voice so shrill and shrieking that I can't stand to listen to her. But I thought it would be useful to listen to her at least last night. And that's this person named Vicki McKenna. And what Vicki, in her introduction of Walker, was saying was, isn't it wonderful that we have reformed the John Doe law? Isn't it wonderful that we have defanged the Government Accountability Board? Isn't it wonderful that we now have free speech by unleashing the right of corporations and their allies to speak freely, i.e. with as much money secretly as they can? Here's what was telling. There were 900 conservatives in that room. People didn't clap. People were a little put off by that. They were a little disturbed by it. I think a lot of them might be even ashamed about that. That's telling. The other thing that's telling, and that I will leave you with, is that in 2012, in the state of Florida, Governor Rick Scott and a Republican-controlled legislature imposed on the state of Florida a very restrictive photo ID law. The idea was that fewer of those types of people that don't vote Republican would be prevented from coming to the polls. You know, people like college students, or Latinos, or African Americans, or certain segments of the elderly population, those kinds of people. And the idea was that that would cinch the state for Mitt Romney and all the other Republicans who were running. Here's what happened in Florida. You know that they also restricted the number of polling places, which we haven't done here yet, but also on the horizon. People lined up, some of them for 12 hours in Florida. They were determined to vote. And they were determined to vote because people like you in Florida made sure they had the ID that was required for them to do it. And they had it. and the result was a larger turnout in 2012 than it was in 2008. And the difference between the conservative vote and the rest of us was much larger. President Obama, for instance, won the state by a much larger margin than he had in 2008. So there are reasons for hope. Don't lose hope. And I hope that between now and November, you will take it upon yourselves to lead in the charge, to get people the identification they need so that we can vote. And then, once we're back in power, bring back voting and all the other things to the way they were.